Welcome to the University of Uppsala, Sweden, where we are pleased to be hosting the international research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospect of Criticism. The project is conducted in collaboration with the University of Louisville, Kentucky, and is funded by the Templeton Religion Trust as part of their Art Seeking Understanding program. In this talk, given on the 12th of February 2026, Maarten Coegnarts of the University of Antwerp presents his ongoing research on embodied sense-making in relation to our understanding of film. Coegnarts draws on the seminal analyses of vectors in painting by Rudolf Arno, and on recent research on the noetic conception of aesthetics and on predictive processing in art. He shows how even rather abstract concepts can be grasped in embodied cognition from perceptual features of works of art. He discusses the role of rhythm and anticipation in this process, and how the resulting epistemic arc can culminate in moments of insight.
Good. Well, welcome to everybody to the first session of this term and this year. We're particularly pleased to be able to welcome Maarten Coegnarts as our speaker at today's seminar. He is, of course, assistant professor in film studies. He's a cognitive film studies scholar at the University of Antwerp. He's also a fellow of the Society of the Cognitive Studies of the Moving Image. He has several publications which is of great interest to us to do with embodied cognition and film. He is also the author of a book with the title Film as Embodied Art, Bodily Meaning in the Cinema of Stanley Kubrick, which came out a few years ago. And since fairly recently, he is also co-editor of the journal Projections, Journal for Movies and Mind. And we were just talking a minute ago about how much he and his editorial team also welcome submissions from philosophers. So perhaps, take a few minutes after today's session and have a look at the website of the journal. It's very worthwhile and has already a track record of publishing work by philosophers and of course, other disciplines, scholars also. But with that, I'm just going to pass the word to our speaker today. Welcome to everybody. Welcome to Maarten. And in about half an hour from now, we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I shall start sharing my presentation. Okay, first of all, I would like to thank Elizabeth and Guy for inviting me here today. So it's a really nice opportunity to share my insights on aesthetic cognitivism. The title of my presentation is Art and Embodied Sense-Making, the Bodily Basis of Epistemic Arcs. In my talk, I will raise two key arguments, both informed by cognitive science. So the first argument will relate some of the claims of aesthetic cognitivism to the theme of embodied meaning making in the arts. And this is an argument rooted in embodied cognition. Second argument will connect the first argument further to the epistemic arc approach to aesthetic experience, and this will be an argument rooted in predictive processing. Within those two arguments, we can highlight three key concepts: aesthetic cognitivism, embodied meaning making, and the epistemic arc. And those three concepts will constitute the threefold structure of my talk. So let's first delve into the concept of aesthetic cognitivism. Here, I would like to draw upon very useful a summary provided by Jeremy Page in his PhD dissertation, where he distinguishes between two standard claims of aesthetic cognitivism and three attendant claims. And to build my first argument, I would like to focus on the first two attendant claims. So the first one being, art's cognitive value is closely tied to its aesthetic form. Its expressive and representational qualities afford understanding. Second attendant claim, art is especially suited to exploring the human condition, emotions, and relationships rather than scientific subjects. So basically, this is a kind of a connection between, on the one hand, the topic of expression, representation, and on the other hand, the kind of conceptual content that we can connect with aesthetic cognitivism. And taking the second attendant claim as a starting point to build up the first argument, So aesthetic cognitivists typically have subject matters of human concern in mind. These subject matters are largely abstract, for instance, emotions, relational dynamics, which poses a representational challenge. If these concepts are abstract, how then can they be expressed in art? In other words, how can we connect it to the first attended claim pertaining to representation? And this is where I think the framework of embodied cognition is very useful, because it suggests that conceptual structure derives from embodiment, and that our reasoning about abstract concepts is metaphorically grounded in bodily knowledge or patterns of sensory motor experience. And this connects also to the work of Lakoff and Johnson. Interestingly, these abstract concepts also include those concepts related to the human condition, such as event structure concepts, a change of state, for example, as well as emotion concepts. And for me, this begs a very interesting question. What then are the fundamental aesthetic building blocks, the elements through which these embodied metaphors, and with them the concepts of aesthetic cognitivism, are manifested in art? And this is where we move on to the second theme then of this talk, embodied meaning making in the arts. So if we place this key concept at the top of this slide, embodied meaning making in the arts, it's a topic that has been well explored and addressed by the American philosopher Mark Johnson, especially in his book, The Meaning of the Body, Aesthetics of Human Understanding, which was published in 2007, and which was heavily influenced and inspired by John Dewey's philosophical work, Art as Experience, among others. If we talk about the arts, then it's often very useful to distinguish between two broad kind of modes of expression or representation. On the left side, you can see representation expression in the fixed arts, painting or sculpture. And on the right side, we have expression in time-based media, such as film, which is my own expertise domain. This is an entire debate on itself. Only I think early this year, this publication was published on What is Spatial Art by Eliza Caldarola in the Journal of British Aesthetics, which attempts to distinguish certain criteria when talking about spatial art. And it also builds upon prior work by Levinson and Alperson, early 1991 paper on what is a temporal art. But let's clear the slide again, and let's now move again to the left side of this slide. So expression in the fixed art. That's where I would like to highlight the significant expressive role of a concept which is perceptual dynamics. And this is a relationship between expression and perceptual dynamics, which is basically at the core of the work of a German art psychologist, Rudolf Arnheim, with books such as Art and Visual Perception and Visual Thinking. If we move to the right side and consider time-based media such as film, another concept becomes important, and that's the expressive significance of rhythm. And here I would briefly make a connection with a very interesting edited volume within the field of analytical art philosophy, published in 2019, The Philosophy of Rhythm, which already highlights stresses the importance of rhythm for expression in the arts. So let's now first turn to the left side again and try to explain and illustrate this connection a bit. And basically, this is trying to explain Arnheim's theory of perceptual dynamics and its connection with expression. Here, I draw upon a kind of summary by Ellen Winner. Winner is an art psychologist and was also, I think, influenced by Arnheim's work. Quote, so what is central to Arnheim's work? Arnheim embraced the concept of similarity and believed that the structure of a work of art conveys emotions that we cannot help but see. What we perceive in pictures is dynamic. We see the motions, the weights, the forces, and these dynamic forces are what convey the emotional properties. To quote Arnheim, we call the movements of a dancer mournful not because we have often seen sad persons behave in a similar manner, but because the dynamical features of mourning are physically present in these movements and can be directly perceived. And this is a claim that can also be backed by some empirical evidence. There's some images on the right side, and a very famous experiment in that sense is the Kiki and Buba experiment. Interestingly, seeing these expressive qualities in visual patterns is true for all perception. So it does not only apply to works of visual art, it also applies to any object of nature, for example, a willow tree. But there is one fundamental difference. Works of visual art are made exclusively for being perceived, and the artist therefore endeavors to create the strongest, purest, most precise embodiment of the meaning that consciously or unconsciously he intends to convey. In great works of art, the deepest significance is transmitted to the eye with powerful directness by the perceptual characteristics of the compositional pattern. So here he already draws a kind of connection between the perceptual dynamics within the compositional pattern and the meanings. So there's a really close connection between the two. And in his work, throughout his work, he provides a lot of numerous rich analyses where he reveals the underlying skeletal of patterns, perceptual dynamics, and he connects it to the meaning of the work. And what is very interesting that he uses these very schematic diagrams to unpack or to layer this connection. And these are a few examples, but there are many, many more rich examples throughout his work. So this is another beautiful diagram. Cézanne's Madame Cézanne in a yellow chair. And this is an interesting quote about another work, a classicist painting by Guérin, Phèdre et Hippolyte. And Arnhem writes about it, it's an episode of human life is reduced to a configuration of visual forces which spells out the conflict diagrammatically. So here I think you can clearly see a connection with the second attendant claim. So the kind of concepts pertaining to the human condition, an episode of human life, and he connects it to a configuration of visual forces as the means to express those concepts. And I think this is also a quote that I would apply to another classicist painting, The Death of Socrates by David. And interestingly, this is also a painting that is discussed by Elizabeth to illustrate the noetic conception of aesthetic experience. Importantly, to make these connections between perceptual dynamics in a compositional pattern and the meanings, often we need more knowledge and we need more context. And so perceiving these connections also depends on personal traits and cultural cognitive capital. So it's something that really should be nuanced here, or should be highlighted as well. Okay, let's move from the fixed arts to film, so my own expertise domain, and try to highlight or try to make a similar kind of argument, but based on another concept, the concept of rhythm. So far we have examined how visual forces function as carriers of meaning within works of art that present their perceptual content as coexisting in space. In film, however, the objects of perception do not coexist in space, but rather constantly shift due to editing, camera movement, motion of objects within the frame. And this is where the concept of rhythm becomes a very useful concept, since it allows us to account for how expressivity may emerge from what Plato famously defined as order within movement. So the challenge here is twofold. So first, to identify and define different types of visual rhythm, and second, to develop a way of diagramming the perceptual shifts that unfold within those rhythms, as such shifts may be where meaning is embodied. To the first question, what kind of rhythms do we have in film? And then my only focus is here on visual rhythm. We have rhythm of stationary objects, which is very closely aligned with rhythm in painting. We have editorial rhythms, we have rhythms of camera movement, and we have rhythms of moving objects. To the second question, okay, how then can we try to diagram the perceptual changes that are inherent to those rhythms? And this is where I approach a videographic method based on keyframe animation, because it's the animation that allows me to diagram the changes in a very schematic way, very much inspired by Arnheim's approach. To illustrate this method, I will now go to my first case study. It's a very short clip from an Indian film directed by Satyajit Ray, Days and Nights in the Forest. And it's about the relationship between a man and a woman.
সেই কনফিডেন্স আর নেই আপনার থেকে থেতলে গিয়েছি
So this is a very close clip, but it's a very significant clip. So we have one change of state. So here we have a man whose confidence is being shattered. And this idea, this change of state, which is a conceptual abstract thing, is fleshed out or spelled out through this decrease of visual size. So in the beginning, it's very large object, but then when it talks, and we have the evidence of the language here, the confidence is no more there. You really have shaken it. And then he is reduced to this very little object when the other female character is included. This is already, I think, a very nice example. It also demonstrates the videographic approach, but it's still not yet a rhythm. A rhythm entails that there should be also repetition and alternation, which is not still the case here. So to demonstrate that, I have a second, a little bit longer clip coming from Antonioni's Story of a Love Affair. It's an Italian film. And it can be placed within the aesthetics of a long take, so there's no cutting. So the entire visual rhythm in the following clip is represented with continuity of time and space. I'm just going to show it to you, and I think the videographic approach will make things a lot clearer. I will spell out the relational dynamics between the couple.
Mostrare non ci pensassimo più. E poi? Anche tu dicevi che non si può continuare così. Sì, ma? Poco fa la tua voce era così triste.
So here we have already a change. She comes forward. Her visual size increases. We have an exit. It already predicts the inclusion again. They are again both in the frame. There is the symmetry.
Da solo non avrei mai potuto. Allora la colpa è mia.
She excludes the male character. There is a tension between off-screen and on-screen space. And we predict the entry of the male character. Very aggressive entry. They're both together in the frame.
È questo che pensi quando mi abbracci? Io non lo penso.
Index vector.
Eppure c'eri anche tu. E anche tu sei stata zitta.
Exclusion of the woman. And we predict the entry again. The woman enters and they leave the scene. So here we can speak of a rhythm because there is a kind of structure, a patterning of different kind of movements. And in a more schematic form, it can be laid out as follows. So to be very reductionistic or in a very schematic form, we have three fundamental conceptual primitives. We have objects, subjects, the characters. We have a mobile frame, the container, and we have a part that's basically a motion vector. These three conceptual primitives can be combined into more animated dynamic patterns, such as exclusion, enclosure, entry, inclusion, and exit. So these are individual dynamic patterns of containment. Then they can be combined, for instance, in a long take, in a much more complex rhythm, which then can flesh out or spell out the dynamics of the relationship, as hopefully the film clip has just shown. Another example, not based on the aesthetics of a long take, but on editorial rhythm. It's a film clip from a French film called Un cœur en hiver.
Non, j'y suis pas. J'y suis pas du tout.
Moi, je trouve que ça va, chez nous.
Mais non, ça va pas. Ça n'a rien à voir avec toi, c'est...
Yeah, so this is another example, but the dynamics are here clearly embedded in an editorial rhythm. And we also have the rhythm of these index factors. And it's without dialogue, but you can, I think, feel the tension between the two characters. And we have the musical rhythm, of course, as well. I have many more examples included in these three video essays for those who are interested, but we have to move on to our third and last key concepts and trying to make the connection with all three of them, the epistemic arc approach. And this is the second argument. So far, we have shown how perceptual dynamics and rhythms play a crucial aesthetic role in fleshing out abstract concepts in art as they appeal to our perceptual cognitive capacities. However, we still need to account for how this argument connects to the trajectory of the aesthetic experience itself, whereby we define the experience as a kind of explorative thought process. And this is basically the connection with Elizabeth's noetic conception of aesthetic experience. And this is where I think a second theoretical cognitive framework proves very useful, one rooted in the predictive processing framework. And this is where I would like to make a link with this really great special issue edited by Frascaroli et al. And I quote from the introduction, "In the last few years, a remarkable convergence of interests and results has emerged between scholars interested in the arts and aesthetics from a variety of perspectives and cognitive scientists studying the mind and the brain within the predictive processing framework. The result is a vast and fast-growing research program that promises to deliver important insights into our aesthetic behaviors." Back again to the argument, what is predictive processing? It's a very technical framework, so really in a nutshell, maybe the core definition. Predictive processing is a top-down theory, inferential theory of cognition, according to which the brain continuously generates and updates predictions about sensory input in order to minimize the difference between expectation and experience. Purely schematically, it can be diagrammed in this way. This is my modest attempt to get a grip on prediction processing theory. And basically, we always make predictions. We compare our predictions with stimuli. And if there is large distance, there will be a kind of prediction error that we will then attempt to minimize again and again so we can update our mental models. And that's kind of the logic. And often when there is a distance, there is an uncertainty. And when there is an uncertainty, then things become very interesting, especially when talking about aesthetics. It's the ambiguity that sets the prediction cycles in motion. And it's also a connection, predictive processing with aesthetics, that Van der Kruis has made themselves in an article. So they introduced the epistemic arc approach to aesthetic experience. So what is an epistemic arc? It's is a cognitive journey of resolving uncertainty during an experience, often found in aesthetic engagement. It involves a cycle of three core concepts: curiosity, sparked by surprising or unexpected sensory information; epistemic action, the active search for explanations; and finally, a kind of epistemic emotion called aha experience, which is a kind of satisfying resolution of that uncertainty. What is interesting then, artworks can build and sustain these arcs to create aesthetic experiences by providing opportunities for the mind to engage in this process of sense-making and discovery. And in their work, they provide many interesting examples, starting with visual ambiguous figures, such as one provided by Hebb. Just quote, "The simple line might make you expect little meaning in it, but that changes once you look a fraction longer, probably because your visual system registers that the line deviates, which is then a prediction error, from what you expect. This prediction error suggests an attention of the drawer, which in turn creates an expected reducibility of the prediction errors, which is fulfilled after brief search with the discovery of a face. But this then again leaves some remaining errors. The one face has an odd contour, which leads to the discovery of a second face. Then when one focuses on this new face, the other loses its edge. Again, a new error, because our visual system can only allocate it to one object and so on. So in a very simple stimulus, like this visual ambiguous figure, there are already microcycles of curiosity, epistemic action, and discovery. And then from this kind of examples, they move on to more figurative surrealist paintings, or this painting Les Perches by Edouard Manet, which interestingly, by blurring this figure-ground relationship with foreground and background, already triggers this uncertainty, this ambiguity embedded in the way it is painted, in the manner it is painted, triggering off this kind of epistemic actions. And this is where I now want to make a connection, not the epistemic arc connecting it to figurative paintings, and not to ambiguous visual illusions or to paintings that rely on perceptual obliqueness. I would like to connect the epistemic arc to film and also to visual rhythm, because that was my first argument. And that's basically the final case that I have in my talk for you all. It's the final scene from a French film called Mouchette by Bresson, Robert Bresson. And it's a film about this 14-year-old young girl who had a very horrible life. So that is an alcoholic. The mother dies, and at the end, she decides to commit suicide, and she attempts 3 suicide attempts. And these attempts are presented through 3 different kind of visual rhythms, but there is a certain change in one of those rhythms which really sets something in motion. So let's move on to the first attempt, the first rhythm. So now please look at the left side. She rolls into the frame, exits the frame, rolls into the frame again. So we have again a rhythm because there's a repetition, alteration, a certain tempo. And on the right side, you can see a kind of schematic diagram. So basically 3 layers. We have visuals, we have diegetic sound, and we have music. In this clip, we have the visuals, and we have the sound. And the sound is not acousmatic because it's still visualized. We hear the rolling of her movement, and we can also see her rolling as well. So sound and visuals is very much connected. Let's now move into the second rhythm. And now the movement goes from right to left. She rolls out of the frame, exit, into another frame, and eventually again lands into the frame. So she's still visible and hearable. So basically the scheme, the diagram on the right is basically the same. So we have exit, entry, exit, and finally entry inside of the frame. Still no music. Sound can be clearly connected to the visuals. And these 2 rhythms already set some predictions ongoing. So on the basis of this, we could predict already a 3rd rhythm, and maybe we would expect something similar, but something else will happen. Again, from right to left, similar as the 2nd rhythm. Falls out of the frame, into the frame. And that's the crucial thing. We do not see her falling into the frame again. And this is a kind of uncertainty that we want to explain then later on. So on a diagrammatical, schematical level, on the right side, we have the visuals, but she's no longer visible at the end. We only hear the sound. So there's exit visuals, but there is still sound. And then we have the final. This is the way the film then eventually will end. We do not see her anymore. We do not hear her anymore. But now something new comes into the audiovisual scene, which is non-diegetic music. It's Claudio Monteverdi's Magnificat. And this is very beautifully how Poussin composes this and orchestrates this rhythm. So first, it's all built upon visuals, sound, which are there in the material, diegetic world of the film. But then in the last final shot, she has left the material world, and then there is the theme introduced of transcendence, and this is a theme which often is connected also to Robert Bresson's film and oeuvre. Yeah. So this was my last film clip, and I would like to end with a quote by Bresson himself. Rhythms, the omnipotence of rhythms, nothing is durable but what is caught up in rhythms. And I thought it would be a nice way to end my talk. Few selected references, and I would like to thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much. Great to hear about your work, and a great talk. We're going to move on to questions pretty fast. Let's see, we've got plenty of hands signaling
that's nice to see.
Gratitude. Here's a question hand. I'll pass over to Guy.
I'm sure you know this often quoted remark of Walter Pater's in his book on the Renaissance about all art constantly aspires to the condition of music. Of course, it's a famous quote, much beloved of people who've worked in music and musicology like myself. But what I find really interesting about these analyses of Arnheim's analysis of vectors and in the visual field and the application of this to film is how much this kind of analysis looks exactly like what we do in music analysis, which is like looking at structures. And one of the kind of interesting things about music analysis, particularly when it relates to tonal music, as to music which is in major and minor keys, let's say, is you can kind of like you can hear the sense of gravity. You can kind of hear that these forces almost have manifest energy, let's say. I mean, that, you really feel that something needs to go somewhere, and when it arrives, you really feel it. So a lot of music analysis is based around exactly the same structures. Obviously, the concept of rhythm is fundamental to music anyway. But a couple of interesting things about that, I think. One is the Pater's point in suggesting that all art aspires to the condition of music was almost exactly the anti-cognitivist point, namely that music has no contrast between form and content, as in there's no content. It's all in itself, and so the idea is basically that's all there is. But then the other thing, I'm just interested in when Arnheim uses language like vectors and forces, and you show these arrows. Obviously, in film clips, you feel the momentum almost kind of like more palpably. Are these understood in the discipline as metaphorical concepts, or what's their kind of like status there? I mean, sorry, I've rambled a long time, but Pater.
No, that's I think that's probably that's a fundamental question. Also, a question that Mark Johnson has dealt with, because when Arnhem introduces kind of new terminology, visual balance, for example. Balance is concepts that we associate with physics. Not immediately, don't make immediately the connection with our perception. But that's what Arnhem does. And Mark Johnson makes the claim that because we all human beings, when describing our perception of artworks, we often resort to this kind of metaphors. Like it looks visually balanced, there is symmetry, and it's because of that there is a certain dynamic balance. And because we all use this kind of metaphors, but embodied, grounded in kind of experiences that we all share, there is a certain kind of objective quality to it. And that makes those metaphors really interesting and fascinating. Because without them, we could not articulate or talk about or reason about our experience of perceiving artworks. And basically also Roger Scruton, because it's interesting that you talk about music. He wrote this great book on music, and he also highlights the importance of metaphors. Without metaphors, it becomes really difficult to explain the meanings of even music, because it's the metaphors that gives the content. Even basic like pitch is verticality. We understand musical qualities, these attributes of music, through embodied qualities. Verticality schema as a movement, motion is crucial in our understanding of music. And for me now, I've done like a lot of research, last couple of years on film, of course, but I grew closer and closer to music, because for me, rhythm is the basis. And also at Lucas School of Arts, where I also teach and do research, there are a lot of musicians, and they all work with rhythms. Rhythm is their core, like the building blocks. They diagram rhythms, and it's so interesting to see how they pronounce it, articulate rhythms, and to see how to make a connection to also film and to other kind of visual art. So that is really something that I would explore in the following years, because rhythm for me is like really fundamental. It's become a fundamental concept with all the challenges, because it's really difficult to diagram rhythm. So it's Arnhem in fixed arts, it's rather static, but to visualize, diagram rhythm in film, it's quite a challenge. I'm not sure if that's a good question, an answer to your question, but
yes, very much so, very much so. So just the other strand of the question was, so Pater makes this observation. Well, he's driving a Pater idea. But his idea basically is that all arts want to kind of lose the idea that they are about anything. So he's got this kind of like historical trajectory, culminating in the kind of like aestheticist movement, but he projects everything back into the Renaissance because it's in this book about the Renaissance. But so the idea is that, in a certain sense, if all our cognitive faculties are bound up with decoding, as it were, the kind of like the motion on the film, then it is like watching a film is indeed like listening to a piece of music, where it doesn't matter if you can contend that the film is about anything or not. What you're watching is kind of like manifest schema or embodied schema.
Yeah, I think we understand a lot by just perceiving and feeling the rhythms of a film. Yeah. I mean, the example with the musician, the cellist, and also the rhythm created by the editorial rhythm, it creates something that is immediately clear for the viewer. And I would say this is the strength of great cinematic works of art, because they are visual storytellers. And all the great ones, Orson Welles, Kubrick, they all play with creating these rhythms. And also for challenging or creating ambiguity. I think Bresson is a beautiful example, how the way he achieves to convey something which is basically very abstract, a moment of transcendence, but he embodies it within creating an like an organization of visual rhythms, and then it changes something. And yeah, that's quite a complex way of embodying something really profound. Bresson is really great work to explore. Yeah.
Good. Thank you both very much. Iris.
Thank you. Thank you, Maarten. This was really interesting, and so nice to see how your views on embodied cognition in relation to aesthetic cognitivism developed from when I first heard the first talk by you. I think this is just a continuation of Guy's question, but I was wondering how should we understand this notion in relation to, let's say, two other forms of art. One is poetry, which is of course quite similar to music, but there is also the linguistic element, where for many people, like the cognitive power of poetry is precisely related to one's capacity to identify the relevant rhythm and then to kind of be taken in what Kant would describe the aesthetic expansion process. So I was wondering, how does your notion of, I mean, how crucial would this kind of visual perception be to the general link that you want to make between embodied cognition and, let's say, cognitive values of a given work? But then going in the other direction, and this goes back to you being a serial watcher who only sees one episode per week. I was actually reading some stuff on serial television, and what they are trying to understand now is how does the way in which, as a viewer, you expose yourself to the serialized fiction, how does that impact your capacity to really engage reflexively and cognitively with what is going on? And I guess one way, on the positive side, there is this idea that you have more time to rethink about things and more time to revisit particular scenes and instances. But then on the other hand, of course, there is this idea that your memory needs to be way more engaged if you wait for a week. So it seems that people are more kind of prone to forget about these particular, let's say, rhythmic characterizations of what particular characters do, right? So I was just wondering whether you think that your research might expand in one of these two directions, or whether whatever notions you come up with will only be applicable to films, just in terms of, spatiality, but also temporality of different forms of art.
Yeah, that's really a good question. I think with regard to poetry, there's, I think even Mark Johnson, definitely George Lakoff and Mark Turner, they first applied their insights on poetry. So I can recommend you some books that really delve into the embodied dimensions of poetry. And basically they show how these embodied schemata underlie poetic sentences. And there is a certain bodily logic, and rhythm and motion becomes very important as a means of expressing things in poetry. So I'm not an expert in poetry, but basically the embodiment thesis by Lakoff and Johnson was first applied only to language. And the metaphors we live by, they analyzed a lot of ordinary linguistic expressions and as evidence for revealing the embodied nature of thinking. And language then is one manifestation of it. And poetry is then an extension of it. My own work, then I extended this similar kind of thinking to film in the first place. Television series, or it's entirely different ball game, I would say. It also has to do with, I think, the importance of narrative comprehension, it also connects to predictive processing. I think, especially Joe Magliano, my co-editor of Projections, they did a lot of work on mental modeling, how we always update our models based on different indexes. It's like when there is a shot change, when there is a change of location, we continually update our mental model. And we make predictions on the basis of that, also with regard to the intentions of characters. And within film, of course, it's all limited within a duration of 2 hours, 120 minutes. But with 4 seasons, 6 seasons, then there's an extension of our mental modeling. So it's expanded in time. But again, I'm not an expert. I like the unity of 90 minutes artwork, a Bresson film, which it's as a certain perfection in only 90 minutes. And personally, that's something different than watching a series, binge watching a series. I must say, Breaking Bad was quite close to being a really beautiful masterpiece of television series. Yeah. But thanks, these are really very fundamental questions, I think, to the debate. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Iris. John.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you. I just wonder if you could say something about a claim in film and literary studies I always found curious. So you look at rhythm and physical motion mostly. Those are your exampple. So the body going down the hill.
Rhythm as a carrier of meaning. Yeah, that's.
As a carrier, but the same idea gets used in accounts of narrative, studies of the novel or film, to talk about how narrative structure, so the timing in the sense of rhythm between the transitions between chapters, for example, or scenes. Or a really interesting example from Bordwell is cut scenes in Ozu films. Just the perfectly placed cut scene in Tokyo Story or Late Spring, laundry drying in the air right after the parents die, right? And it's the problem if you extend the notion of rhythm. It's hard to understand how it's something that's experienced if you apply it to a whole narrative structure. right? It's so extended over time. But it's interesting to do so because it produces just the way cutscenes do in Tokyo Story. It produces a lot of meaning, obviously, and a lot of emotional meaning, right? That's it. Thank you.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. Nice to make the connection with Ozu. Yeah, but maybe to comment on that, I think because I teach also visual narratology, so I study a lot of narratology. What I find fascinating that often there's certain patterns that can be identified at different levels. And I mean a pattern like cycles of tension and release, which can be identified at a micro level of like one film clip, but it can also be extended. But basically, that's also the story structure, a narrative structure, where you have this kind of setup, and then you have the tension development, and eventually kind of resolution. So I think it's interesting to see how it all connects. So on the micro level, certain cycles and rhythms, tension and release, but also on a larger macro level. But it's a huge challenge. I think it's something that I've pondered about a lot myself.
Good, great. Thank you both. Vid, nice to see you.
Yes, and you, and nice to see you again, Maarten.
Yeah, nice to see you.
So this is kind of forming in my head, so I'll try to formulate it as coherently as possible. So I was very convinced by your analysis, especially this third case, the final case study really worked for me. But I guess I was wondering, how might you distinguish cases where rhythm carries the kind of meaning that you're describing versus those where rhythm is simply either a part of the convention or it's there, but it's not doing any kind of work. So for instance, maybe one could say that with jokes, right, there is always this famous rhythm, 1, 2, 3, 3 people go into a pub and the funny thing happens on the third thing. Or in a talk show, they will change the shot, not so much to kind of create rhythmically, to create a sense of dynamism and interest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that, oh, now there's this shot, now there's this shot, and this carries some kind of meaning. It's simply to make it interesting, right? And I think my understanding is that that is the big motivation of how shots are timed, and whether they're timed, for example, extremely quickly or in a long way, right, has to do with sustaining the viewer's attention. Mm-hmm. So how do you distinguish those cases where rhythm is somehow significant versus those where it's part of the body, part of the baseline of what this art form is?
Yeah, that's a really good question, fundamental question. As you can see, I select Robert-Bresson for a particular reason. It also, I would say, it depends, first of all, I think, on the kind of expectations embedded, the kind of invitation that the work of art affords. I mean, the Bresson affords to make a connection. It invites to make a connection between the rhythms and the higher order meanings. But that's not always the case. A lot of films, they do not invite you to make these connections between perceptual form, rhythm, and then concepts or meanings. And it also depends to make the connection with Arnhem. So he analyzed a lot of paintings, but often one needs to have the context. You need to know the story, for example, to see and to make a connection between the perceptual dynamics and then maybe the essence of a story. If you do not know a biblical theme, it's very difficult to see the connections. And that's something I think it also depends on the viewer, of course, and also if you can. Sounds maybe a little bit abstract, but the work of art should afford something, should invite you to go to have this kind of explorative thought process. Not every film, obviously. I mean, a Michael Bay film or all these other commercial films, they do not afford this kind of making these relations or connections on a higher level. So that would be maybe a short answer to your question.
Did you want to come back a bit or? No, good. Thank you very much. Hello, Tsaki.
Thanks for that. Could you just say something about the distinctly aesthetic aspect of all this? It seems to me that if we were working with examples from religion, so if you're talking now to a group of philosophers of religion, you could have the same examples, the same ideas about. So if you're analyzing prayer, if you're showing us clips of different ways in which people pray, they get together, the hierarchies, the rhythms, the repetitions, people stand, people prostrate, do this in various rhythms and various pacing of all that. And there are expectations and there are ways of breaking the expectation as part of praying. Some of the stuff you do in silence. All of what you've shown, it seems to me, could apply to rituals and to religious practices. And I was wondering, so you happen to show us aesthetic examples from films and paintings, etc. But did you happen to show us, or is there anything distinctly aesthetic about this thesis?
If you talk about these rituals, are you talking about representations of these rituals, or?
Oh, the actual no. This is no representations. Actual
no representation. Yeah, I think because what's interesting about Arnhem analyzed a lot of paintings, and these are all representations, and in a sense, a lot of biblical themes and rituals represented in a single configuration, and it's basically the kind of the composition, the kind of the configuration of the way all these forces relate to each other, that they could kind of grasp or spell out the essence of a biblical theme. And that's, I think, something different if we would just with an object in reality, because there we do not have this composition, this single configuration of all these forces that tries to grasp the essence of an event. But then again, in order to interpret and to see these links, these relationships between patterns in a compositional form and the meanings, one has to have the story content, and one has to have a little bit more context. If you do not know the Bible, it becomes very hard to make this, I think, to make these connections. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's an answer to the question.
Good. Should we move on, or would you like to follow up on that?
It seems if the ritual is about representing a biblical story, I can see how you, but often rituals are not about that. They're about connecting to God in various ways. So and creating a conversation or a plea or whatever. This isn't representation. This is an attempt to direct communication, which follows all the patterns that you've shown, like inclusion, exclusion, hierarchy, rhythm, and embodied experience, deeply embodied experience, because you don't just verbalize the words, you do something when you verbalize the words. So and this could enrich your thesis, but then you have to have a distinction between what we do when we pray in an embodied way and try to do something totally different than experience aesthetic values than what we do when we watch a film.
Yeah.
Okay, but you have to have that kind of.
Okay. That's really great food for thought. I think
We're going to take one more question, and Jacopo has the word. I think you're still on mute.
Right. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Perfect. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much, Maarten. That was fascinating. As you know, I'm a fan of your work, and I'm looking forward to seeing it developing. I was wondering about the distinction you made about spatial and temporal art, in particularly whether it has some role to play theoretically in your account, or whether it was just a sort of convenient way of presenting things. Because one of the sort of motivation that pushed me and Sander to develop this sort of epistemic arc story was to highlight the fact that also static stimuli, such as paintings, do have this temporal character. in them. And that's why, for example, people when analyzing composition talk a lot about rhythm as well. So I was wondering about that.
No, I fully agree with you. And basically it was for convenient reasons, because Arnhem, he only analyzed these perceptual dynamics in what he himself calls like the fixed arts, in the sense that everything is restricted to one single configuration. That's the painting in front of you, and everything relates to each other and spells out the meaning. And that's basically the difference that I wanted to address, because when I turn to film, it's extended in the time. We talk about, of course, we have rhythm in a painting as well. He talks about perceptual dynamics and rhythms as well. He also uses this terminology, but I would say in film, as hopefully my clips have shown, there is something composed over time. So one cannot limit to one single configuration. It's a kind of a trajectory phrasing. We have exit, inclusion, exclusion, and that together makes a phrase that you cannot have in one single painting. So there is I think, a distinction, but there is also something that connects them both, because rhythm is also important for analyzing meaning in fixed arts painting. But I fully agree. It's something that that I thought about myself as well. Yeah. But good to see you. It's nice because we have had like an email exchange, and now I can see and hear you. It's nice.
Yeah, it's nice to see
And
you as
Jacopo
well.
is our invited speaker in a few weeks' time.
I hope to attend. Yeah.
Continue the exchange. My remaining job is to thank Maarten again for sharing his work with us, and thank everybody for joining us and for engaging in such an interesting conversation. But thanks again, Maarten, and welcome to the network, as it were. And I hope you continue exchanging your ideas and sharing your work with us for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this recorded seminar from the research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospects of Criticism. To find out more about the project, please go to our website www.aestheticcognitivism.com.